Imagine this. You're sleeping peacefully in your bed. It's early morning, so early the sun hasn't even thought about rising yet. San Francisco is quiet, calm, beautiful. And then, without warning, the entire world starts to tear itself apart. The ground beneath you doesn't just shake. It convulses. It bucks like a wild animal trying to throw you off. Buildings that have stood for decades crumble into dust in seconds. Fires erupt across the city, turning the sky orange and red. And you? You're just trying to survive the next 5 minutes. This isn't a nightmare. This is April 18th, 1906, and this is my story of how I survived the worst natural disasters in San Francisco's history. But before we dive in, if you love history told from the ground level, real stories from real people who lived through extraordinary events, smash that subscribe button. Trust me, you're going to want to stick around for this one. Now let's go back to a time when San Francisco was the crown jewel of the West Coast, and nobody saw the devastation coming. San Francisco in 1906 was something special. Picture it with me. This wasn't just any city. This was the city if you lived on the West Coast. Nearly 400,000 people called it home, making it the 9th largest city in the entire United States. The streets bustled with activity, cable cars clanging up and down the hills, merchants hawking their goods, the smell of fresh bread from bakeries mixing with the salt air from the bay. The architecture? Stunning. Victorian houses painted in vibrant colors lined street after street. Grand hotels like the Palace Hotel stood as monuments to wealth and progress. Opera houses, theaters, restaurants serving cuisine from around the world. Chinatown was the largest Chinese settlement outside of Asia. Little Italy brought the flavors and sounds of the Mediterranean to California. This was a city built on gold rush money and sustained by ambition. I was 23 years old that spring. I'd moved to San Francisco 2 years earlier from a small town in Ohio, chasing the same dream everyone else was: opportunity. I worked as a clerk in a shipping office down by the Embarcadero. Nothing glamorous, but it paid the bills. I rented a small room in a boarding house on Howard Street, south of Market. Mrs. Chen, my landlady, was a widow who ran a tight ship but had a kind heart. Life was good. Simple, maybe, but good. I remember the day before the earthquake so clearly. April 17th was a Tuesday. Warm, sunny. I finished work around 6 in the evening and walked home through the crowded streets. I stopped at a street vendor and bought roasted chestnuts. I can still smell them if I close my eyes. That night I went to bed around 10 o'clock. I had no idea I was living my last moments in the old San Francisco, the San Francisco that was about to disappear forever. 5:12 a.m. That's when it happened. That's when everything changed. I was deep asleep when the first tremor hit. And let me tell you something, this wasn't like any earthquake anyone had experienced before. This wasn't a gentle rumbling that makes you wonder if maybe a heavy wagon just rolled by. This was catastrophic. The initial jolt literally threw me out of bed. 1 second I was horizontal, dreaming about whatever mundane thing you dream about, and the next second I was airborne, crashing onto the wooden floor. The entire building started making sounds I'd never heard before, creaking, groaning, screaming like a living thing in agony. My room was on the 3rd floor, and I could feel the whole structure swaying. Picture being on a ship in a storm, except you're supposed to be on solid ground. The floor rolled beneath me in waves, actual waves, like the earth had turned to water. The sound was deafening, glass shattering, wood splintering, people screaming, and underneath all of it, this deep, terrible rumbling that came from somewhere deep in the earth itself. It sounded angry, primordial, like the planet was reminding us exactly who was in charge. I tried to stand up, but it was impossible. The shaking was too violent. I crawled toward the door frame. I don't know why, some instinct told me that's where I should be. I grabbed onto the frame and held on for dear life. The main shock lasted somewhere between 45 seconds and a minute. That might not sound like long, but let me tell you, when the earth is trying to kill you, 60 seconds feels like an eternity. Every second stretched out, endless, as I waited for the building to collapse on top of me. My dresser toppled over. The mirror shattered, sending glass flying across the room. The oil lamp I kept on my nightstand crashed to the floor. Books, clothes, everything I owned became projectiles, bouncing around the small space, and then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The silence that followed was almost worse than the noise. For a few heartbeats, everything was still. I stayed frozen in the doorframe, my knuckles white from gripping the wood, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might break through my ribs. Was it over? That's when I heard Mrs. Chen calling out from downstairs. "Everyone out! Get out of the building, now!" I didn't need to be told twice. I stumbled back into my room, moving on autopilot. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely function, but I managed to pull on my trousers over my nightshirt and shove my feet into my boots. I grabbed my coat from where it had fallen on the floor. The hallway was chaos. Other tenants were emerging from their rooms, everyone in various states of dress, everyone with the same expression of shock and terror on their faces. Mr. Kowalski, an elderly Polish immigrant who lived next door to me, was bleeding from a cut on his forehead. Miss Sarah, a young school teacher who rented the room across the hall, was crying quietly, clutching a photograph to her chest. We made our way to the stairs in a panicked herd. The staircase had shifted. I could see gaps between the steps and the wall that hadn't been there before. Every step I took, I expected the whole thing to collapse. But we made it down. All of us. We spilled out onto Howard Street, and that's when I got my first real look at what had happened. And oh God, it was bad. The street looked like a war zone. Buildings had collapsed into piles of rubble. Brick facades had sheared off, exposing the interiors of homes like grotesque doll houses. Telephone poles were down, wires sparking and whipping around like angry snakes. The cobblestones had buckled and cracked, creating treacherous valleys and peaks. People were everywhere, screaming, crying, calling out names of loved ones. Some were injured, bleeding, limping. Others just stood there in their nightclothes, staring at the destruction with blank, shocked expressions. The sun still hadn't risen. Everything was happening in that eerie pre-dawn darkness, lit only by the few gas lamps that were still functioning. And then I smelled it. Smoke. I looked north, toward the direction of downtown, and saw the orange glow on the horizon. Fires. Multiple fires, already starting to spread across the city. That's when the aftershock hit. It wasn't as powerful as the main quake, but it was strong enough to send everyone screaming again. I dropped to my knees instinctively. More buildings that had been barely holding on collapsed. More glass shattered. The ground felt unstable, unreliable, like it might open up and swallow us whole at any moment. When the aftershock passed, Mrs. Chen gathered those of us from the boarding house. "We need to move," she said, her voice shaking but determined. "The fires are coming. We need to get to the parks, to open space." She was right. I could see it in the way the smoke was spreading, smell it in the air. The fires were going to be the real killer here, but I couldn't leave. Not yet. "My friend," I said. "Thomas. He lives on 6th Street. I need to find him." Mrs. Chen grabbed my arm. "You'll die if you go into that." I looked at the growing inferno in the distance, then back at her. "He's all alone. He doesn't have anyone else." She held my gaze for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Be careful. Be fast. Get to Golden Gate Park when you can." I promised I would, even though I had no idea if I'd be able to keep that promise. And then I started running toward the fires. Running through San Francisco that morning was like running through hell itself. The sun was starting to rise now, but you could barely tell. The smoke was so thick it blocked out the light, turning day into a weird, apocalyptic twilight. The air was acrid, burning my throat and lungs with every breath. I tied my handkerchief around my nose and mouth. but it barely helped. The fires were spreading faster than anyone could have imagined, and here's the thing that made it so much worse. The earthquake had destroyed the water mains. The fire department was trying to fight the blazes, but when they connected their hoses to the hydrants, nothing came out. No water. No way to stop the flames. I watched firefighters standing helpless as buildings burned, their faces showing the crushing realization that they couldn't save the city. The streets were packed with people trying to flee. Everyone was carrying something: suitcases, bundles of clothes, family heirlooms, children. An elderly Chinese man was pushing a wheelbarrow filled with what looked like his entire life. A woman in a silk nightgown was clutching a bird cage with a canary inside. People's priorities in crisis are fascinating and heartbreaking. I pushed against the current of refugees, heading deeper into the danger zone while everyone else was trying to escape. People grabbed at me, asking where I was going, telling me I was crazy. Maybe I was, but Thomas was my best friend. We'd met on my second day in San Francisco, and he'd shown me around, helped me find work, kept me from being completely lost in this big city. I couldn't abandon him. 6th Street was only about 6 blocks from where I'd been, but it took me nearly an hour to get there. I had to detour around collapsed buildings, navigate streets that had become impassable canyons of rubble, avoid areas where fires were already raging out of control. I saw things I'll never forget. A man trapped under a fallen beam, screaming for help while flames crept closer. I tried to lift the beam, along with 2 other men who stopped, but it was too heavy. We couldn't move it. The man's screams followed me down the street. A mother sitting on the curb, rocking back and forth, holding a child's shoe. Just one shoe. She was calling a name over and over. Emma. 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 A looter smashing his way into a jewelry store, stuffing his pockets with watches and rings while the world burned around him. Nobody stopped him. What was the point? The Hall of Records was burning. The old City Hall, this massive, beautiful dome that had been the pride of San Francisco, was a shattered ruin. The earthquake had exposed how corrupt the construction had been. They'd used substandard materials and pocketed the difference. Now the building that was supposed to survive anything was rubble. By the time I reached Thomas's building, I was coughing so hard I could barely breathe. The building was still standing, but barely. It leaned at an angle that made me sick to look at. I ran inside, taking the stairs 2 at a time. Thomas, are you here?" His apartment was on the 2nd floor. The door was ajar. I pushed it open and found complete chaos inside. Furniture overturned, a crack running up the wall so wide I could see daylight through it. "Thomas! Here! I'm here!" I followed his voice to the bedroom and found him pinned under his wardrobe. His leg was bent at an angle that made my stomach turn. Oh God, I said, rushing over. "Are you okay?" "Do I look okay?" He grimaced, trying for humor even in agony. "I've been better. Can you get this thing off me?" I got my hands under the wardrobe and lifted with everything I had. Thomas cried out as the pressure released, then managed to drag himself out from under it. His leg was definitely broken. "We need to get out of here," I said. "The fires are coming." "I can't walk." "Then I'll carry you." I helped him up, getting his arm around my shoulders and taking as much of his weight as I could. He was a big guy, nearly 6 feet tall and built like someone who actually did physical labor, unlike my clerk's frame. But adrenaline is a hell of a drug. We made our way back down the stairs, Thomas gritting his teeth against the pain with every step. The building groaned around us, settling, shifting. I kept expecting the whole thing to come down on our heads. We got outside just as another aftershock hit. Thomas and I went down hard on the sidewalk. I felt something in my shoulder pop, but I couldn't worry about that now. I got us both back up and kept moving. The smoke was getting thicker. I could see flames now, just a block away and spreading fast. The heat was intense, like standing too close to a massive bonfire. "We're not going to make it," Thomas said, his voice weak. "Yes, we are. Shut up and keep moving." A fire wagon rushed past us, bells clanging, horses wild-eyed with fear. The firefighters weren't even slowing down anymore. They were in full retreat. We made it another block, then another. My shoulder was screaming in pain. My lungs felt like they were full of broken glass. Thomas was getting heavier, or I was getting weaker. Probably both. That's when I saw them. The soldiers. The army had moved in fast, setting up checkpoints and trying to establish some kind of order in the chaos. A group of them were at the intersection ahead, directing people toward the safe zones. "Help!" I shouted, waving my free arm. "He's hurt! We need help!" 2 soldiers ran over. They took Thomas from me, and I almost collapsed with relief. They got him onto a stretcher, and a medic started examining his leg. "You did good," one of the soldiers said to me. He was young, maybe 19, with eyes that had seen too much in the past few hours. "Where are you headed?" "Golden Gate Park. My landlady said to meet there." He nodded. "Smart. Get moving. The fires are jumping blocks now. The whole area south of Market is going to be gone soon." I looked back at where we'd come from. The flames were a wall now, consuming everything in their path. If we'd been 5 minutes slower... I didn't let myself finish that thought. "Can you walk?" the medic asked me. "Yeah, I'm fine. Your shoulder's dislocated. I'll worry about it later." He gave me a look that said he'd seen this kind of stubborn stupidity all morning, then shrugged. "Your call. Go west. Stay ahead of the fires. Don't stop for anything." Thomas grabbed my hand. "Thank you," he said. "You saved my life." "We're even," I said. "You saved mine when I first got here. Remember, you kept me from starving." He managed a weak smile. "Get out of here. Be safe." The soldiers were loading him onto a wagon with other injured people. I watched them go, then turned west and started walking. The trek to Golden Gate Park was a nightmare. The city was unrecognizable. Streets I'd walked down every day were gone. Buildings I'd passed 1,000 times were smoking ruins. The Palace Hotel, that grand monument to luxury, was burning. The ferries at the docks were overwhelmed with people trying to escape across the bay, and the fires just kept spreading. I learned later that the earthquake had caused more than 50 fires to start simultaneously across the city. Broken gas lines, overturned stoves, downed electrical wires. There were ignition sources everywhere, and with no water to fight them, they merged into massive firestorms that created their own weather patterns. The heat was so intense, it created updrafts that sucked in more air, feeding the flames, making them burn hotter and spread faster. The fire department, in a desperate attempt to create fire breaks, started using dynamite to blow up buildings in the fire's path. But most of the firefighters didn't have proper training with explosives. Instead of creating effective fire breaks, they often just spread the fires further, sending burning debris flying into new areas. I saw one of these demolitions go wrong. They were trying to destroy a row of buildings on Market Street, but the explosion sent a shower of burning wood raining down on buildings 2 blocks away. Within minutes, those buildings were ablaze too. It felt apocalyptic, biblical. Like God had decided San Francisco needed to be wiped off the map, and we were all just ants scrambling before the flood. I passed through Chinatown, and my heart broke. The earthquake had hit this area particularly hard. The buildings here were older, more densely packed. So many had collapsed. I saw families digging through rubble with their bare hands, searching for loved ones. The smell of incense from the temples mixed with smoke and dust. An old Chinese woman pressed a bundle into my hands as I passed. "Take," she said. "Keep safe." I tried to refuse, but she wouldn't take it back. Inside was a jade pendant on a silk cord. I put it around my neck under my shirt. I still have it today. The hills were the hardest part. San Francisco is nothing but hills, and trying to climb them after hours of walking, with a dislocated shoulder and smoke-damaged lungs, nearly killed me. I had to stop frequently, gasping for air, coughing up black phlegm. But I kept going. What choice did I have? I wasn't alone in my journey. The streets were rivers of refugees, everyone heading west, away from the advancing fires, rich and poor, side by side. I saw a banker in a three-piece suit covered in ash, walking next to a prostitute in a torn dress. Class distinctions had evaporated. We were all just survivors now. People shared what they had. A woman handed me a piece of bread as I passed. A man offered me water from his canteen. In the midst of all this destruction, there was humanity, kindness. It gave me hope. But there was darkness, too. I saw the soldier shoot a looter who refused to stop when ordered. The man's body lay in the street and people just stepped around it. The mayor had given orders. Looters were to be shot on sight. Later, I learned that this policy was probably illegal and definitely resulted in some innocent people being killed. But in the moment, with the city falling apart, nobody questioned it. I also saw people being turned away from certain streets. The wealthy neighborhoods, Nob Hill, Russian Hill, had private security forces that weren't letting refugees pass through. They were protecting their property even as the city burned. It made me angry, but I was too tired to do anything about it. Finally, after what felt like days but was probably only 3 or 4 hours, I crested the last hill and saw Golden Gate Park spread out before me. The park was a sea of people, thousands and thousands of refugees, all seeking shelter in the one place the fires couldn't reach. Tents were going up everywhere. People had brought whatever they could carry and were setting up makeshift camps. I stumbled into the park and collapsed on the grass. For the first time since the earthquake struck, I felt something like safe. I closed my eyes and might have passed out for a few minutes. When I opened them again, the sun was higher in the sky and someone was shaking my shoulder. The good one, thankfully. "Hey, you can't sleep here," a voice said. I looked up to see a middle-aged woman with kind eyes. "Sorry," I mumbled. "Just need a minute." "Your shoulder," she said, noticing the way I was holding it. "It's dislocated, isn't it?" "Yeah. My husband's a doctor. Come on. Let's get you sorted out." She helped me up and led me through the organized chaos of the park to a medical tent. Her husband, Dr. Morrison, was treating an endless line of injured people, but he took a moment to examine my shoulder. "This is going to hurt," he warned. "Everything hurts already. What's a little more?" He manipulated my arm and there was a sickening pop as the joint slid back into place. The pain was blinding for a second, then dulled to a manageable ache. "Thank you," I gasped. "Keep it immobilized for a few days and get that cough looked at when you can. Your lungs sound terrible." I nodded, but we both knew there were people who needed his attention more than I did. I thanked him again and stepped out of the tent. That's when I heard my name. "Here, over here." It was Mrs. Chen, waving from about 50 yards away. I felt a wave of relief so strong it almost knocked me down. I hurried over to where she'd set up a small camp with the other people from our boarding house. Mr. Kowalski was there, the cut on his head bandaged. Miss Sarah, still clutching her photograph. A few others I recognized. We'd all made it. Mrs. Chen hugged me, which surprised me. She wasn't usually the hugging type. "I was worried," she said simply. "Thomas?" I asked. "Your friend?" I saw them taking wounded to the Presidio. If he was with the soldiers, that's probably where he is. The Presidio was an army post on the northern edge of the city. It made sense they'd use it as a medical center. "He's going to be okay," I said, more to convince myself than anything. Mrs. Chen nodded. Then she handed me a blanket and pointed to a spot on the ground. "Rest, you look like death." I didn't argue. I wrapped myself in the blanket, lay down on the grass, and for the first time in hours, I let myself relax. But I didn't sleep. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt the earth shaking beneath me. Instead, I lay there and watched the smoke rise from the city. From our vantage point in the park, we could see it all. The fires were still spreading, consuming block after block. The entire skyline was changed, Buildings I'd known were just gone. People around me were crying, praying. Some were in shock, staring at nothing. Others were already trying to organize, setting up kitchens, distributing supplies, checking on the elderly and children. It's strange what crisis brings out in people. You see the absolute worst, the looters, the price gougers, the people who would step over a dying man to save their own skin. But you also see the absolute best, the neighbors who risk their lives for strangers, the people who give away their last piece of bread, the communities that come together when everything else falls apart. As the day wore on, more and more people streamed into the park. Each wave brought new stories of horror. Entire neighborhoods gone, families separated, people still trapped in the rubble, the fires still advancing. By nightfall, the glow from the burning city lit up the sky. It was beautiful in a terrible way. Golden Gate Park, normally dark after sunset, was illuminated by the light of our dying city. Someone started singing, a hymn, I think. Others joined in. The sound spread through the park, thousands of voices raised together in the darkness. It was one of the most moving things I'd ever experienced. That first night, I barely slept. The ground kept shaking with aftershocks. Every tremor sent people scrambling, screaming. We were all traumatized, jumping at shadows, and the fires burned on. The earthquake was over in about a minute. The fires burned for 3 days. Let that sink in for a moment. 3 days. I watched from Golden Gate Park as San Francisco burned. We all did. Thousands of refugees huddled in the park, in the Presidio, at Fort Mason, anywhere the flames couldn't reach, watching helplessly as our city was consumed. The second day was worse than the first, if you can believe that. The fires had merged into one massive conflagration that was marching steadily westward. The firefighters had given up trying to put them out and were now focused entirely on creating fire breaks to stop the advance. They used dynamite. They used artillery. The army brought in field guns and started shelling buildings to create wider gaps for the fire to jump. The sound of explosions rolled across the city like thunder. I volunteered to help where I could, even with my bum shoulder. They had us digging fire breaks, hauling supplies, setting up more tents as the number of refugees kept growing. It felt good to do something, anything, other than just sit and watch. That second day, I managed to get to the Presidio to check on Thomas. The army had set up a massive field hospital there, with hundreds of injured people laid out in rows. It took me an hour to find him. His leg was in a splint, and he looked pale and exhausted, but he was alive. "You look terrible," he said when he saw me. "You should see the other guy," I replied, sinking down on the ground next to his cot. We sat in silence for a while, just being grateful to be alive. "They're saying 4 square miles are gone," Thomas said quietly. 4 square miles of the city just erased. I believe it. What are we going to do? It was a good question. I didn't have a good answer. "Survive," I said finally. "We survived this far. We'll figure out the rest." A nurse came by and told me I needed to leave so Thomas could rest. I promised to come back when I could, then made my way back to the park. The scene there had evolved. What had started as chaos was becoming organized. The army had taken control, setting up food distribution points, medical stations, and organizing the refugees into something resembling camps. People were building more permanent shelters out of whatever materials they could scavenge. Mrs. Chen had somehow acquired a large piece of canvas and turned it into a proper tent. She'd also started a small cooking fire and was making soup for anyone who wanted some. "How?" I asked, amazed. She just shrugged. "People need to eat. The army gave us some supplies. I'm making use of them." That was Mrs. Chen. Practical to the core. The apocalypse could be happening around her, and she'd still make sure everyone was fed. I gratefully accepted a bowl of soup. It was thin, mostly water with some vegetables and a hint of meat, but it was hot, and it was food, and it was the best thing I'd ever tasted. As night fell on the second day, The fires were still raging. The glow had actually gotten brighter. The heat was so intense you could feel it even from the park, several miles away. I learned later that the fires had reached temperatures of over 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit in some areas. Hot enough to melt glass, hot enough to turn brick into powder. Buildings didn't just burn, they were incinerated, leaving nothing but ash and twisted metal. The third day brought a small miracle. The wind changed. I don't know if you've ever seen how wind can affect a fire, but it's incredible. The fires had been pushed steadily westward by the prevailing winds, but on the third day, the wind shifted and started blowing from the west, pushing the fires back on themselves. It gave the firefighters their first real chance to get control. They'd also finally figured out how to pump water from the bay. Salt water isn't ideal for fighting fires, but it's better than nothing. Fire boats sprayed water onto buildings along the waterfront. The army used dynamite more strategically, creating effective fire breaks that the fires couldn't jump. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, they started to contain it. By the evening of the third day, the fires were finally under control. Not out, there were still hot spots burning in places, but contained. The danger of the entire city burning was over. The relief that washed over the refugee camps was palpable. People cried. They hugged strangers. Some fell to their knees in prayer. We'd survived. But as the smoke began to clear, the true scale of the devastation became visible. Over 500 city blocks were gone. Gone, not damaged, not burned, gone, completely erased from existence. 28,000 buildings destroyed. The entire financial district. Most of Chinatown. South of Market, where I'd lived. The beautiful Victorian houses. The grand hotels. The Opera House. City Hall. The Hall of Records. All of it just gone. The death toll was harder to determine. The official count would eventually be listed as around 700, but that was a lie. A politically motivated undercount to make the disaster seem less severe. The real number was probably closer to 3,000, maybe more. Many bodies were never recovered, incinerated in the fires. Many Chinese immigrants weren't counted in the official tallies. Many people who died in the camps in the following weeks from injuries and disease weren't included. 3,000 people. 3,000 lives ended. 3,000 families torn apart. 3,000 futures erased. I think about that number a lot. I think about the man trapped under the beam, the mother with the shoe, all the people I saw and didn't see, all the stories that ended on April 18th, 1906. But you know what? More than 200,000 people were left homeless, and most of them survived. Most of them rebuilt their lives. That has to count for something. Living in a refugee camp is an experience I wouldn't wish on anyone. Golden Gate Park became home for me and thousands of others for the next several months. The army set up tent cities with designated streets and addresses. Can you imagine that? Tent cities with street names, but it gave people some sense of normalcy, some structure to hold on to. Our little group from Mrs. Chen's boarding house stayed together. We pooled our resources, shared what we had, looked out for each other. In a way, we became more of a family than we'd ever been when we were just tenants in the same building. The city provided basic rations, bread, rice, beans, coffee. The army set up field kitchens that served meals at designated times. It wasn't much, but it kept us from starving. Disease was a constant worry. With that many people living in close quarters, with questionable sanitation, the conditions were ripe for outbreaks. There were cases of typhoid, dysentery, pneumonia. The medical teams worked around the clock trying to keep people healthy. I got lucky. My dislocated shoulder healed. My lungs recovered from the smoke inhalation. I came through the whole ordeal with nothing more than some bruises and a cough that lasted a few weeks. But the mental scars, those took longer to heal. I couldn't sleep properly for months. Every little noise would wake me, heart pounding, convinced the earthquake was happening again. The aftershocks didn't help. We felt them for weeks, sometimes multiple times a day. Each one sent me right back to that moment, being thrown from my bed, feeling the world trying to shake itself apart. A lot of people in the camps had the same problem. You'd hear people crying out in their sleep. You'd see them jump at sudden sounds. We were all traumatized, though we didn't have that word for it back then. The city's response to the disaster was complicated. On one hand, there was incredible relief work. Food and supplies poured in from across the country. Other cities sent firefighters, medical personnel, construction workers. The Red Cross set up operations. Churches, charities, civic organizations, everyone mobilized to help. On the other hand, there was corruption and incompetence. Donated supplies went missing, probably sold on the black market. Reconstruction contracts went to cronies and friends rather than the most qualified companies. The official casualty count was deliberately kept low to make the disaster seem less severe and protect property values. There was also racism. The Chinese community was hit particularly hard by the earthquake, but they received less aid than white residents. There were even discussions about not allowing Chinatown to be rebuilt in the same location, trying to use the disaster as an excuse to push the Chinese population out of the valuable downtown real estate. Thankfully, those plans failed. The Chinese community fought back and rebuilt their neighborhood. The African American community faced similar discrimination, and the poor in general were treated as second-class citizens in the recovery efforts. It was ugly. It reminded me that even in disaster, the worst aspects of human nature don't just disappear. But there were bright spots too. I saw communities come together in ways I'd never witnessed before. Neighbors who'd barely spoken to each other before the earthquake now shared everything they had. Strangers became friends. People from all walks of life worked side by side to rebuild. There was this feeling of possibility. The old city was gone. Yes, but that meant we could build a new one, a better one. San Francisco could rise from the ashes stronger than before. And it did. The rebuilding started almost immediately. Even while parts of the city were still smoldering, people were already making plans. Architects drew up designs for new buildings. Engineers figured out how to make structures more earthquake-resistant. City planners proposed new layouts, wider streets, better infrastructure. There was debate about whether people should even rebuild. Some argued that San Francisco was just too risky, too prone to earthquakes, that everyone should relocate, but most people rejected that idea out of hand. This was our city, our home. We weren't going to abandon it. I got work helping with the cleanup. They needed all hands, and I needed the money. We'd spend days digging through rubble, salvaging what we could, clearing space for new construction. It was back-breaking labor, and the pay wasn't great, but it felt good to be part of the rebuilding. I found strange things in the ruins. A child's doll, perfectly intact amidst total destruction. A safe that had survived the earthquake and fire with thousands of dollars inside. We turned it into the authorities and it was eventually returned to the owner. Photographs, letters, jewelry, all the little pieces of people's lives that had survived when so much else was lost. Each find felt like a small victory against the disaster. Thomas recovered enough to leave the hospital after a few weeks. His leg would never be quite right again. He walked with a slight limp for the rest of his life. But he could walk. That was the important thing. He moved into the tent city with us. Mrs. Chen didn't even hesitate, just made space for him like he'd always been part of our little family. We'd sit around the fire at night, all of us survivors, and tell stories about our lives before the earthquake, about what we'd seen during the disaster, about our plans for the future. Those conversations kept us going, kept us human. The tent cities lasted through the summer and into the fall. Slowly, as buildings were repaired or rebuilt, people started moving back into the city proper. The tent populations dwindled. Our group stayed together longer than most. We'd been through something together, and none of us was ready to break that bond. But eventually, we all had to move forward. I found a new apartment in late 1906 in a building that had survived the earthquake with only minor damage. It was in the Western Addition, a neighborhood that had been largely spared. It was smaller than my old room, more expensive, but it was walls and a roof, and that felt like luxury after months in a tent. Thomas found work as a security guard. His injury meant he couldn't do the heavy physical labor he'd done before, but he was steady and reliable, and that counted for something. Mrs. Chen surprised us all by not reopening her boarding house. Instead, she started a restaurant. A small place, just a few tables, but her cooking attracted a loyal following. She said the earthquake had taught her life was too short to do things you didn't love, and she loved cooking. Last I heard, her restaurant was still operating 30 years later, run by her daughter. Miss Sarah, the school teacher, met a doctor who'd come from New York to help with the relief efforts. They fell in love amidst the chaos and were married in a tent with 100 refugees as witnesses. It was one of the most beautiful weddings I've ever attended. Mr. Kowalski moved in with his son in Oakland. He'd lost everything in the earthquake, and at his age, starting over in San Francisco just seemed too daunting. We all scattered eventually, as people do. But we stayed in touch. Once a year, on April 18th, we'd meet at the same spot in Golden Gate Park, where we'd all survived together. We'd share a meal, tell the same stories, remember the people who didn't make it. That tradition continued until there were no more of us left to meet. San Francisco's recovery was nothing short of miraculous. Within 3 years, most of the destroyed areas had been rebuilt. New buildings rose from the ashes, many of them more beautiful and more earthquake-resistant than what had come before. The city adopted new building codes, requiring stronger construction methods. Steel frames, reinforced concrete, flexible joints that could move with the earth. The lessons learned from the 1906 earthquake influenced building design not just in San Francisco, but around the world. The new City Hall, completed in 1915, was designed to be earthquake-proof. It featured a massive steel frame encased in granite, with a dome that was structurally independent of the rest of the building. It was a symbol of the city's resilience and determination. And you know what? That building survived the 1989 Loma Prieta earthquake with minimal damage, while modern buildings around it collapsed. The engineers in 1906 knew what they were doing. The fire department was completely overhauled. They installed an auxiliary water system specifically for firefighting, with its own pumps and reservoirs, separate from the drinking water supply. They installed cisterns throughout the city that could be accessed even if the main water mains broke. Those systems are still in place today, still maintained, still ready in case another major earthquake hits. The ferry building survived the earthquake and became a symbol of continuity. It was the heart of the city's transportation system, and keeping it operational was crucial to the recovery effort. I used to love watching the ferries come and go, seeing the crowds of people, knowing that life was returning to normal. Chinatown was rebuilt, bigger and more vibrant than before. The community came together to preserve their culture and neighborhood, despite efforts to push them out. They turned their quarter into a tourist attraction, leaning into the exotic appeal as a way to secure their economic future. It worked. Chinatown became one of the most visited areas of the city. The Palace Hotel, that grand symbol of old San Francisco, was rebuilt even grander than before. They added steel framing, modern fire suppression systems, and it reopened in 1909 to great fanfare. I couldn't afford to stay there, obviously, but I went to the grand opening celebration. They had free champagne in the lobby. I took a glass and toasted to the new San Francisco, the city that refused to die. The city's population recovered remarkably quickly. Within a few years, it was back to pre-earthquake levels. People wanted to live in San Francisco. The disaster hadn't changed that. If anything, it had proven how resilient the city and its people could be. The 1915 Panama Pacific International Exposition was held in San Francisco, less than a decade after the earthquake. It was a massive World's Fair, designed to show the world that San Francisco had not just recovered, but thrived. The exposition attracted almost 19 million visitors and showed off the rebuilt city in all its glory. I went to the exposition several times. I saw the Tower of Jewels, covered in cut glass that sparkled in the sun. I watched new technologies being demonstrated, talking motion pictures, transcontinental telephone calls. I ate foods from around the world. I marveled at the Palace of Fine Arts, a beautiful Greco-Roman structure that still stands today. It felt like a celebration not just of the city's recovery, but of the human spirit's ability to overcome anything. But even as the city rebuilt, the earthquake wasn't forgotten. There were memorials to those who died, plaques marking where important events had occurred. The survivors carried the memories with them, sharing their stories, making sure the next generation understood what had happened. I became one of those storytellers. As I got older, I found myself talking about the earthquake more and more. At first it was painful. I didn't want to relive those hours of terror, but eventually I realized that telling the story was important. It honored the people who died. It reminded the living not to take anything for granted. It taught lessons about preparedness, resilience, and community. Schools would invite me to speak. I'd stand in front of classrooms full of children and tell them about the morning the earth shook, about the fires that burned for days, about the tent cities and the rebuilding, about how their city had died and been reborn. They'd listen with wide eyes, trying to imagine it. San Francisco was their home, stable and permanent in their minds. The idea that it had once been rubble and ash was almost incomprehensible. But they needed to know, because the earth hadn't finished with San Francisco. The San Andreas Fault was still there, still building tension, still waiting to release it. And it would happen again someday. The 1906 earthquake taught us so many lessons. Some we learned well, others not so much. We learned that unreinforced masonry buildings, brick buildings without steel frames, are death traps in earthquakes. They collapse easily, killing everyone inside. San Francisco banned them after 1906, and most other earthquake-prone cities followed suit. We learned that fires can be just as deadly as the shaking, maybe more deadly. The damage from the earthquake itself was terrible, but it was the fires that destroyed most of the city. Modern earthquake preparedness focuses heavily on preventing post-earthquake fires. We learned that water infrastructure needs to be earthquake-resistant. When the water mains broke in 1906, the firefighters were helpless. Now we build redundancy into water systems, with multiple supply lines and backup sources. We learned that emergency response needs to be coordinated. In 1906, there was chaos. Different agencies working at cross purposes, no clear chain of command. Modern disaster response is much more organized, with clear protocols and communication systems. We learned that communities are more resilient than we think. When everything falls apart, people come together, they help each other, they rebuild. That hasn't changed in over a century. But we also forgot some important lessons. As the years passed and the generation that lived through 1906 died off, complacency crept back in. New residents moved to San Francisco with no understanding of the earthquake risk. Buildings were constructed that didn't meet seismic codes. Preparedness drills were skipped. Emergency supplies weren't maintained. It's human nature. When disaster hasn't struck in a long time, we convince ourselves it won't strike at all. And then the earth reminds us. In 1989, the Loma Prieta earthquake hit. It was smaller than the 1906 quake, magnitude 6.9 compared to 7.9, but it was still devastating. 63 people died, thousands were injured. The Cypress Street Viaduct in Oakland collapsed, crushing dozens of cars. A section of the Bay Bridge fell. I was long dead by then, but I like to think I would have recognized the signs. The same patterns repeating, the same lessons having to be relearned. See, the thing about earthquakes is that they're inevitable. If you live in earthquake country, it's not a question of if, it's a question of when. The San Andreas Fault runs right through California. It's going to slip again. Maybe tomorrow. maybe in 100 years. But it will happen, and when it does, we need to be ready. The people of San Francisco in 1906 weren't ready. They had no warning systems, no building codes, no emergency plans. They paid for that lack of preparation with thousands of lives and an entire city destroyed. Today, we're better prepared. We have early warning systems that can give a few seconds of warning before the shaking starts. We have buildings designed to flex and sway rather than collapse. We have emergency supplies stockpiled. We have plans in place, but is it enough? I don't know. I hope so. I hope that the lessons learned from 1906 have been taken to heart. I hope that when the next big earthquake hits, and it will hit, the loss of life will be minimal because we were prepared. But hope isn't enough. Preparation requires vigilance. It requires investment. It requires taking the threat seriously, even when the earth has been quiet for decades. It requires remembering that the ground beneath our feet, solid and reliable as it seems, is anything but. Living through the 1906 earthquake changed me in ways I'm still discovering decades later. I'm not the same person I was on April 17th. That version of me died when the earth shook. The person who emerged from the ruins was different, harder in some ways, softer in others. I learned what I was capable of. Before the earthquake, I thought of myself as ordinary, unremarkable. Just another clerk in a shipping office, one of hundreds of thousands of people trying to make their way in the world. But when everything fell apart, I discovered reserves of strength and courage I didn't know I had. I ran into burning buildings. I carried a man twice my size to safety. I survived days of horror and came out the other side. That knowledge stays with you. Even when life returns to normal, even when you're back to the mundane routine of work and bills and everyday concerns, you remember. You remember what you're capable of when it matters most. But I also learned about fragility, about how quickly everything can be taken away. One moment you're sleeping peacefully in your bed, and the next moment your entire world is rubble. Everything you own, everyone you love, every plan you've made, all of it can disappear in 60 seconds. It's a terrifying realization. It could make you paranoid, afraid to love or invest in anything because it might be taken away. But for me, it had the opposite effect. It made me appreciate what I had while I had it. It made me less willing to put things off until tomorrow, because tomorrow might never come. It made me more willing to tell people I cared about them, to take risks, to really live instead of just existing. The earthquake taught me about community. Before April 18th, I was friendly with my fellow tenants at the boarding house, but I didn't really know them. We were just people who happened to live in the same building. After the earthquake, they were family. We'd survived something together, and that created a bond that couldn't be broken. Mrs. Chen, Mr. Kowalski, Miss Sarah, they weren't just acquaintances anymore. They were the people who'd shared my tent, my food, my fears. I learned that humans are at their best when things are at their worst. Yes, there were looters and profiteers. There always are. But they were vastly outnumbered by the people who helped, who shared, who risked their own safety for strangers. That gives me hope. When I look at the world and all its problems, when I see people fighting over trivial things and forgetting what really matters, I remember Golden Gate Park. I remember thousands of people from every background, every social class, every ethnicity, coming together to survive. If we can do it in our darkest hour, we can do it any time. We just usually choose not to. The earthquake also gave me perspective. The things I used to worry about. Was I earning enough money? Was I successful enough? What did people think of me? They all seemed so small after watching a city burn. What mattered was being alive, having people you cared about, having a purpose. Everything else was just noise. I wish I could say I maintained that perspective forever, that I never again sweated the small stuff, but I'm human. Over time, as life settled back into routine, I found myself worrying about trivial things again, getting annoyed at minor inconveniences, forgetting how lucky I was just to be here. But then I'd remember, usually on April 18th, but sometimes just randomly. I'd remember the feeling of the earth moving beneath me, the sight of the city burning, the sound of people calling out for lost loved ones. And I'd take a deep breath. I'd look around at my life, imperfect, messy, ordinary, and I'd feel grateful. The nightmares never completely went away. Even as an old man, I'd occasionally wake up in the night, heart racing, convinced the earthquake was happening again. The sound of thunder could trigger it. A heavy truck rumbling past, any sudden noise or movement that my brain interpreted as seismic activity. Post-traumatic stress, they call it now. We didn't have a name for it then. We just lived with it, those of us who survived. But you know what? I'd take the nightmares, because they meant I survived. They meant I got to have a life after the earthquake, even if that life was forever colored by what I'd experienced. So many people didn't get that chance. I think about them often. The man trapped under the beam, the woman with the shoe, the 3,000 named and unnamed dead. They didn't get to rebuild their lives. They didn't get to see the new San Francisco rise from the ashes. They didn't get to grow old and tell their stories. I survived for them too. That's how I came to see it. I had a responsibility to live well, to appreciate the gift of life I'd been given, because so many others didn't get that gift. It's a heavy responsibility, but it's also a privilege. San Francisco is a special place. I know every city's residents probably think their home is special, but there's something about San Francisco that's different. Maybe it's the geography, the hills, the bay, the fog rolling in like a living thing. Maybe it's the history, the gold rush, the earthquake, the cultural revolutions. Maybe it's the people, the dreamers and builders and artists who've always been drawn here. Or maybe it's the resilience. San Francisco has been tested again and again. The earthquake and fire of 1906, the Depression, World War II, the social upheavals of the 1960s, the AIDS crisis, the 1989 earthquake, and each time the city has survived. More than survived, it's thrived. That's not an accident. That's a choice made by hundreds of thousands of people over more than a century to not give up, to rebuild, to push forward. I'm proud to have been part of that story. After the earthquake, I stayed in San Francisco for the rest of my life. I had opportunities to leave, job offers in other cities, friends who moved away and wanted me to join them, but I couldn't go. This city had tested me, had taken everything from me, and I'd come through. I felt bound to it in a way I can't fully explain. I watched it grow and change. The skyline filled with new buildings, each one taller and more impressive than the last. The population swelled. New neighborhoods developed. Technologies that would have seemed like magic in 1906 became commonplace. But some things stayed the same. The hills were still there, just as steep. The fog still rolled in on summer afternoons. The cable cars still climbed up and down, bells clanging. And the sense of community, that feeling that we were all in this together, that persisted too. I got married in 1910. Her name was Margaret, and she was a nurse who'd come to San Francisco to help with the relief efforts. We met in the tent city. She was treating my cough, and I made her laugh with a stupid joke, and somehow that turned into a courtship and then a marriage. We had 3 children. I told them stories about the earthquake, but I don't think they fully understood until they were older. How could they? They'd grown up in a stable, rebuilt San Francisco. The idea of the city being destroyed was abstract to them. I worked for the city planning department for most of my career. I wanted to be part of making sure that when another major earthquake hit, the city would be ready. I helped implement building codes, design emergency response plans, improve infrastructure. It was my way of honoring the people who didn't make it. If my work saved even one life in a future disaster, it would be worth it. Thomas remained my best friend until he died in 1952. We'd get together every Sunday for lunch, and we'd talk about everything and nothing. Sometimes we'd talk about the earthquake, but mostly we'd talk about our lives, our families, current events. Just two old friends enjoying each other's company. His death hit me hard. He was the last person who'd been with me through all of it, who understood what we'd survived. After he was gone, I felt more alone in my memories. Margaret died in 1958. 52 years of marriage, ended by a heart attack that came without warning. I was lost for a while after that. We'd been through so much together. She'd been my anchor, but I had my children and grandchildren, and they kept me going. I told them about their grandmother, about the city, about the earthquake. I wanted them to understand where they came from, what had come before. I died in 1967 at the age of 84. Pneumonia, which is a gentle way to go, all things considered. I was surrounded by family, in my own bed, in my own home. I had a good life. Not an easy one, not always a happy one, but a good one. I lived to see San Francisco rebuild and prosper. I raised a family. I contributed to my community. I made a difference, even if it was a small one, and I survived the earthquake. That's not nothing. That's something to be proud of. If you're watching this, you're probably not in San Francisco in 1906. You're somewhere else, some other time. But the lessons from that day still matter. Disaster can strike at any moment. I don't say that to scare you, but to remind you, the ground beneath your feet isn't as solid as it seems. Life isn't as stable as we pretend it is. Everything can change in an instant. But here's the thing. That's not a reason to live in fear. It's a reason to live intentionally, to appreciate what you have, to tell the people you love that you love them, to not put off your dreams until someday, because someday might never come. The earthquake taught me that the universe doesn't care about your plans. It doesn't care if you're a good person or a bad person, rich or poor, young or old. Disaster is indiscriminate, but it also taught me that humans are capable of incredible things. When everything falls apart, we come together, we help each other, we rebuild, we survive. That's the real story of the 1906 earthquake, not the destruction. That's just what happened to us. The real story is what we did after, how we picked ourselves up, dusted ourselves off, and built something better. San Francisco today is a testament to that resilience. The city that rose from the ashes is more beautiful, more diverse, more vibrant than the one that burned. The lessons learned from disaster made it stronger. If you live in earthquake country, be prepared, have emergency supplies. Know what to do when the shaking starts. Make a plan with your family. Don't assume it won't happen to you. But if you don't live in earthquake country, the message still applies. Whatever disaster might come your way, hurricane, flood, fire, pandemic, economic collapse, be as ready as you can be. Build community. Look out for your neighbors. Don't take anything for granted. And remember this, you're stronger than you think. You can survive more than you imagine. When the moment comes, when everything is falling apart around you, you'll find reserves of courage and strength you didn't know you had. I know because I lived it. I was nobody special. Just a clerk in a shipping office, average in every way. But when the earth shook and the city burned, I did what needed to be done. I survived. I helped others survive. I rebuilt. If I could do it, anyone can. The 1906 San Francisco earthquake killed thousands of people and destroyed 4 square miles of one of America's greatest cities. It was a tragedy of immense proportions, but it wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of a new chapter. A chapter about resilience, about community, about the indomitable human spirit that refuses to be defeated. San Francisco is still here, thriving, beautiful. Built on the rubble of the old city, yes, but also built on the determination of hundreds of thousands of people who refuse to give up. I'm proud to have been one of them, and if you ever find yourself in San Francisco, take a moment to think about what happened there in 1906. Look at the buildings and remember that they stand where others fell. Walk through Golden Gate Park and remember that it once housed thousands of refugees. Touch the ground and remember that it once shook with terrible violence. But also remember that the city survived. The people survived. Life went on. That's the real miracle. So that's my story. That's how I survived the San Francisco earthquake of 1906. I've told it dozens of times over the years, and it never gets easier. Reliving those days, remembering the fear and the loss, it takes something out of me every time. But it's important. The story needs to be told. The people who died deserve to be remembered. The lessons learned need to be passed on, because it will happen again. Not necessarily in San Francisco, though it will happen there too eventually. But somewhere, sometime, disaster will strike. The earth will shake, or the waters will rise, or the fires will spread. That's the nature of living on this planet, and when it does, I hope the people caught in it will remember stories like mine. I hope they'll remember that survival is possible, that communities can come together, that cities can be rebuilt. I hope they'll find the strength to endure. I hope they'll carry on, because that's what we do. We survive, we rebuild, we carry on. That's the human story, that's my story, and now it's yours too. If this story moved you, if it taught you something, if it reminded you of what's important, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. Share your thoughts, share your own stories of survival and resilience. And please, hit that subscribe button. I have more historical stories to tell, more voices from the past that deserve to be heard. Every week, I dive into a different moment in history, bringing you the real human stories behind the dates and facts you learned in school. Hit the bell icon so you don't miss the next one. Share this with someone who loves history or needs a reminder of human resilience. And remember, appreciate what you have while you have it. Tell the people you love that you love them. Be prepared for disaster, but don't live in fear. Live intentionally. Live fully. Live like you survived the earthquake. Because in a way, we all do. We all survive something. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next one.